As we return to Matthew chapter 13 to get an idea of where we are, where Matthew has brought us, I want you to imagine that, let's say, a while back, the city of Calgary had announced that they were going to build the biggest structure, the biggest building that the world has ever seen. Not another office building, not another arena, but something massive, something bigger than the Great Pyramids, something more iconic than the Eiffel Tower, something taller than the biggest building in Dubai. This would have changed the skyline of Calgary forever. And possibly, as big as it sounds, it could change the Earth's skyline from space. Now, coming with this, we were told, let's just imagine, that this was going to come, the builder would arrive and he would build this massive structure. And what happens is until he arrives, we get to see the finished picture. We get to see what this finished masterpiece is going to look like. And all the news channels are reporting on it. All the architects are analyzing it. Everybody is talking about it and what it will be. And we get this promise that when the builder comes, this is what's going to happen. But over time, the longer it takes for the builder to arrive, the more those two ideas begin to get mixed, and people start thinking about the end result and the builder's arrival as if it was sort of the same time. And one day, finally, the builder comes. And of course, we all go out to Calgary to see this thing. And as we drive there, we kind of expect something to catch our eye, something massive, something undeniable that you cannot miss in the middle of that city. But instead, as we get there, we think it's going to be finished, and we arrive at the location, and we find a small fenced-off lot with a couple machines, a couple survey stakes, and 12 men who are just moving dirt around. And in front of it, the builder is there telling everyone, the building is here. And we naturally begin to ask questions. Where is it? Why is it so small? Why doesn't it look like what we thought it was? Are we sure the builder can actually do what he says he's going to? And before long, those doubts about the project become doubts about the builder. And I think it's similar to what we find in Matthew chapter 13. For centuries, Israel had anticipated and was looking forward to the kingdom of God on the earth. And the way that they thought about it was what the prophets declared. They said it will be glorious, it will be victorious, it will be everlasting and worldwide. And when the king came, they were expecting this whole thing to be built in a day. And so they come and they see when Jesus announces the kingdom of heaven is at hand. It's here now. And what they find is not what they thought. They don't find a palace, a throne, a government. They don't find a revolution. What they find is a Jewish rabbi from Nazareth with 12 ordinary guys teaching around the Sea of Galilee. And so they ask questions based on what they see. Where is the kingdom? Why is it so small? Why is it taking so long? And all these kinds of questions are arising. And at this point in Matthew's gospel, people are beginning to not just think the project is not taking place, but they're doubting the builder. They're doubting Jesus is truly the king. And so what Matthew does here is he takes the parables of Jesus, which are meant to answer our kingdom questions, and he puts them all into this one chapter to answer them. And so that's what we find here in this chapter. We've gone through a few already, and we find unexpected answers. And that's the thing we need to realize, that so many people have an idea in our minds, this is what it will be like. And though the prophets painted the picture, we didn't realize how it would all come to be. And though we're disappointed, Jesus wants to answer these questions and tell us this is how it was going to take place. Today we're just going to look at two short parables that answer two of our questions. Let's begin in verse 31. Jesus tells them a parable, and he imagines the kingdom of heaven is like a small, ordinary grain of mustard seed. I don't know how much you know about mustard, but it was sort of an everyday spice. People used it in their food. They would also use it sometimes for medicinal purposes. And so this idea of a mustard seed isn't that fantastic. It's not very surprising. However, why Jesus chooses a mustard seed is the surprising part. I want you to think about this. He's comparing the kingdom of heaven to something. Now, what would he choose? If he was like other kingdoms at that time, he would have described it like a tree, like a mighty cedar, or a steadfast oak tree, or maybe a fruitful palm tree. But instead, Jesus doesn't choose those like other kingdoms. He chooses to describe his kingdom like an unimpressive shrub in a garden. So think about the contrast between what he's saying and what people were expecting. Throughout the Old Testament, the prophets talked about other kingdoms, Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, these world empires, and they were described like massive trees. And Jesus, if he wanted to impress his audience, he could have definitely picked something more impressive. Those were strong and majestic. They were impossible to ignore. They were massive. And instead, Jesus intentionally chooses mustard to describe the kingdom of heaven. He goes to the shelf, as if, I imagine it like this, like a farmer goes to the shelf of all of his seeds. And it says in the parable that it was like a man who took the mustard seed. That's on purpose. He didn't just happen to have a mustard seed. It's not all he could find. He went and took one, and that's what he wanted. And then it says that he sowed it in his field. And that's the way that Jesus describes the kingdom of heaven. Now, verse 31 emphasizes that the man took the mustard seed, and then in verse 32, he knows full well it is the smallest of all the seeds, at just 1 millimeter in size. It is so small. The mustard seed was used in ancient proverbs. It was used in common everyday language to compare with something and saying it's really tiny, like a mustard seed. Jesus says this in chapter 17 when he talks about the smallest amount of faith possible, like a mustard seed. So this is on purpose. This is how he's describing the kingdom. And yet, in spite of its small beginning, verse 32 highlights its unexpected ending. That when it has grown, it is larger than all the garden plants. So the original audience knew more about mustard than we do. So just in case we don't, mustard seeds did grow quickly. And they spread aggressively. That there is evidence in some Jewish ancient documents that they were discouraged from planting mustard seed in their gardens because it was so invasive. It was so hard to control, and it grew up to about 12 feet high. So as much as it is a garden plant, it wasn't meant really for the garden. But it was like that. And so it kind of helps us understand why Jesus would have chosen the mustard seed. It's not like all the other garden plants. And then, not stating a scientific fact as we know it today, he says something interesting. He says it grows to be the biggest one, and then he says it becomes like a tree. But it's a shrub. And so we can get caught up in the science of it all, but what he's saying is, he's not talking about gardening. He's talking about those ancient metaphors, those kingdom comparisons, where he says it becomes a kingdom, like a tree, like the other trees, like Egypt and Assyria and Babylon. He's saying that it starts so small, and then it gets to be the biggest in its garden, that it is bigger than all the other garden plants, like a tree in which birds, he says, can come and find a nest, find a home. That's the kind of kingdom that he is explaining here. And at the end of this parable, we're just left to ask the same question as the first original audience was, which is, how is the kingdom of heaven like that? And Jesus' answer is remarkably simple. The kingdom looks small to begin, because it is small. That when people went out to see Jesus and his disciples and hear his teaching, they were expecting one thing, and what they found was the seed of the kingdom. The kingdom of heaven is at hand, and they saw a rabbi and 12 guys walking around the lake. There's no army, there's no palace, There's no throne in Jerusalem. There's no political revolution taking place. If this truly was the greatest kingdom that the world would ever know, it looked far more like a mustard seed than it did a mighty cedar. And that's exactly what Jesus wants us to see. He showed us the beginning. He showed us the beginning stage, and all we saw was a seed, but where he wants to take us, even us today, is to say, this is what it is now, but it will become something. And we'll be questioned to see if we have the faith in the word of a king to actually believe that and to trust him and to see it through. The point isn't just that the kingdom's going to grow. The point is that it begins where no greatness is expected, but it ends where no greatness of its kingdom can be denied. And so this is what we see. Jesus is moving our eyes away from the seed. He says, stop looking at the seed and listen to my word. Listen to where this is going. The king is trying to lead us to see the end. And it shouldn't surprise us if we think about this analogy, how it's such a small seed that becomes large. This is how Jesus or God works. We've read through Matthew many times. And we've seen this is how he does things. Jesus wasn't born in Rome. He wasn't born in Jerusalem either. He was born in Nazareth. And he wasn't celebrated as a national hero, as if everybody loved him. He was the carpenter's son, whom they dismissed. And he didn't begin. He didn't go to the powerful and the influential people, where all the money is and the wealth and the expertise and everything begins. He didn't start there. He went and he chose fishermen. He chose tax collectors. He chose ordinary people like us. See, the kingdom began in a way that was absolutely easy to overlook. Just like you go to see this massive building and all you see is dirt. It's not there yet, and you might think, well, this doesn't meet my expectations. This doesn't look like what I thought it was going to look like. What Jesus is telling us here is that you're right. All you're seeing right now is the seed. The point is not that the seed is just small. The point is that it starts small and then it grows large. And the ending will barely resemble what it was at the beginning. If you look again at the parable, you'll notice that the man who sows the seed, he kind of disappears from the story. He's there, it gets planted. It's all about the seed here. It's not about his skill or his effort or his ability. The emphasis shifts to the seed and what it becomes, and the fact that no one is there to make this happen. It's assumed or implied that God is the one who causes the growth. This is what we would expect, that the king himself will build his kingdom, and that this is how it advances. It doesn't advance because the people come in and they're extra organized and clear and they know what to do. They have skills and power that they bring to this. No. God starts it and God finishes it. The king is what brings this about. And his hearers knew about mustard and how it grows in gardens and how invasive it can be. And it's as if it's saying that once it takes root, there's nothing really that it can stop it. It's going to grow. It's hard to control, and it will become very large. So he isn't comparing his kingdom to something impressive as we would like to think of. I mean, we would think of 100 different ideas before we ever came up with, a mustard seed's a great idea. And so we need to understand what he's telling us, the mystery of the kingdom. He's comparing it to something ordinary that once it's planted, it will become something. And it won't be easily stopped, and it becomes much larger than anyone would ever expect. And so Jesus describes what it will become. It becomes tree-like. It says, with the birds of the air coming to make nests in its branches. And so Jesus is moving beyond the garden. He's saying it's outgrown what it would normally fill. And it's going to become truly worldwide. Like the other trees and kingdoms that are described by the prophets, this one will take over the entire world. The birds will come. It will be so big that the birds will come like the other nations that will come and live under its rule. A mustard tree. Not expected, but this is what Jesus is claiming. This is what Jesus is telling his people. So it's not even just that the Gentiles will come, although they will. It's that he's declaring this little kingdom, remember what it started as, will become a worldwide kingdom. That's why Matthew's gospel quietly draws on this throughout its gospel, from beginning to end. Remember, in the very beginning, Jesus is born, and as a child, so there's men from the east, the Magi. They come and they worship King Jesus. We've already seen a centurion. He has remarkable faith in King Jesus. There will be a Canaanite woman who receives mercy from King Jesus, and what happens at the end? The risen king is commissioning his disciples to go and make disciples of all the nations. And so this is how the kingdom works. There is a period of time that it will grow. It's going to take some time, but it will become what Jesus says it is. What begins as a mustard seed in Galilee was always intended to become a worldwide kingdom for the whole world. And so now the mystery comes into focus with these details. The prophets had already revealed what it would become. Jesus is describing how it will get there. And that's what we need to trust. That's what we need to hear. That's what we need to understand by this parable. We ask the question, why is it so small? And Jesus is telling us, it starts small. You're still looking at just the seed. You're expecting the finished masterpiece, and Jesus is showing us the construction site. The question isn't whether the kingdom will get there. The question is, will we believe what the king is telling us, even when we're still just looking at the seed? The next parable, it joins together very closely, and they're very short. They do go together. The kingdom of heaven, Jesus says, is like leaven, which is a staple in every household. Everybody had leaven in their homes because they made bread every week. Leaven is the agent that causes the dough or the flour to rise so that it's softer and fluffier and lighter when you eat it as bread. And so this was a normal everyday thing. Leaven was the thing that made it rise. And so what they did was every batch, they would take part of it that was leavened and they'd put it aside. They'd eat all their bread, and the next time they make bread, they would use that small amount of leaven, just a sample. They would put it back into the new dough, the new batch, and it would leaven all of that. Then they would take another sample and put it aside. And you start with such a small amount of leaven, and it just over and over, it was so powerful that it would go through batches and batches and batches of dough. In this case, we see here that Jesus describes a woman who was the typical bread maker of the day. She took and hid in some flour the leaven. Now there's two things that I find unexpected in this. It's a common thing. Everyone knew about the process, except Jesus uses a different word. He doesn't say she mixed it in. She doesn't say she kneaded it in, as we would expect. He says she hid it, like she was hiding something in the dough. And so it's a weird way of saying it, but Jesus is trying to make a point here. He's saying that it was put in the dough so that you could not see that leaven at all. You couldn't find it if you were looking for it. It was covered, it was concealed, it was hidden. In verse 44, Jesus will use the same word, hidden, like treasure in a field. You couldn't see it. It was buried. It was out of sight. Okay, that's the first thing. Jesus wants us to know that part. The second uncommon part is that he says she put it into 3 measures of flour. Do you know how much bread you can make with 3 measures of flour? You can feed over 100 people. And so for some reason, Jesus is saying this is not the average weekly bread that this woman is making. She's making a ton. It is a lot of flour. And he's trying to make a point with that as well. Because at the end of it, he says this, with 3 measures of flour, even though there was that much, that leaven eventually leavened all of it. So now we have this picture in our mind of how this is work. He's trying to compare this with the kingdom of heaven. That somehow the small amount of leaven that was normally saved for a smaller batch was put into a large batch, and it invisibly and completely permeated the whole batch of dough. And after finishing this parable, everyone is left wondering again, how is the kingdom of heaven like that? This time, Jesus isn't answering why the kingdom looks so small. That was for the mustard seed. This time, we want to know why it seems so hidden. We know that it's small. We can see it grow as a mustard plant, but sometimes we think, is it doing anything? Is it even growing? I'm looking for something, and Jesus here is saying, so much of the work that goes on in this kingdom happens out of sight, where nobody can even see it. You might think nothing is happening, and yet it's just this lump on the counter, and yet Jesus is saying, oh, it's working. It has begun. There's lots going on, and it won't stop until the whole thing is done. And this is something we need to understand as well. It's not according to our expectations or what we would prefer, but Jesus is revealing the mystery. In fact, the moment that it completely disappears from sight, where it's hidden in the world, it starts doing its greatest, deepest work. That's how leaven works, and Jesus is saying that's how the kingdom works as well. It doesn't just come and go around people, it works within people, in their hearts. That the reign of Christ, when Jesus comes and his kingdom is established in your life, or in specific areas and peoples and groups, all of a sudden the work is beginning and it is moving. And though you can't see it in the heart, people are being changed. It changes our desires. It convicts us of our sin. It creates faith within us. It produces obedience. It produces repentance. It forms love in our lives. We become humble and submitted to Christ as our King more and more over time. And much of this happens in a way we don't like it. It happens quietly. It happens gradually. It happens internally in places that only God can actually see it. And so Jesus is revealing this mystery. Because hidden work eventually becomes visible, doesn't it? Where things are so permeated, it says that once it begins, it will permeate the whole thing. And that in our own hearts will begin to be seen. In our own homes, in our own relationships. They're changing in our churches, in our communities, in our nations. Not all at once, and not often with the big show, the big spectacle that you might hope for. But little by little, person by person, heart by heart, the King's hidden reign begins to permeate entirely what it begins in. And even that enormous amount of dough or flour that Jesus mentions tells us, it kind of reinforces that idea. How far can it go? Can it actually do all of the work that it's meant to do? And Jesus is saying that it just gets hidden in there. Eventually, all of it is leavened. That this whole world will be ruled by Christ in the end. We can't see it. Its influence is quiet, but it's never inactive. It might be hidden, but it is never powerless. We might think so based on what our eyes tell us, but Jesus is telling us a mystery, what we cannot see. So when we go and we look at Jesus and we wonder if the kingdom has really come, why can't we see more happening? See, that's our expectations. We want to look in certain places for certain things, and Jesus says, it's here. It's already working. And though you can't see it, it surely will finish what it begins. You're only looking at the surface. God's kingdom is already working beneath what we can see. And I think if we just step back for a moment now with these two parables, they're not unrelated. Jesus is giving us two windows to look at the same kingdom. He's answering two of our questions. One of them is, the mustard seed answers the question, why does it look so small? And the leaven answers the question, why does it seem so hidden? Why isn't it more obvious? And these are questions that we wrestle with, don't we? We ask these things, but together they reveal the mystery of how it'll actually work. He's saying to us, stop looking just at the seed and determining what you think. Stop looking at that flower on the counter and determining what you think. Don't just look at it. Listen to my words. Believe what I'm telling you. And we need to submit ourselves to the word of the King. That though it will grow outwardly, it first grows inwardly. And though it will expand publicly, and we'll see it, it will transform privately first. And one day, the greatness of this kingdom will be evident, but for now, we have to trust it is working, it is great, and it will become what Jesus says it will. There's something else I noticed in all of these parables, especially in these two. Jesus doesn't explain the kingdom. When he thinks about comparisons, he's not going to the emperors or the big kingdoms or the governments or the influential in this world. He doesn't go to those people. He uses ordinary people doing ordinary things. And I think that's encouraging. We have a farmer who goes out to sow. We've got a woman who makes bread, a man who's walking in a field, a fisherman who casts a net. All of these things are so simple, so everyday, and it's because Jesus doesn't need for his kingdom to expand and to grow and to work. He doesn't need all of the earthly resources and people. He does it through ordinary people, in ordinary ways, in ordinary lives, because those lives have been brought under the rule of an extraordinary king. And then right here, Matthew interrupts the parables. You'll see in this chapter, if your Bible has red letters, there's lots of red, and then it's black. Matthew interrupts. Jesus didn't stop here. Matthew is telling us something that we need to hear. Not Jesus in the middle of his sermons or his parables. Matthew says, okay, hold on. We need to remember something. We need to understand why Jesus is telling all these things in parables. And it's important. He says in verse 34 that all these things Jesus said to the crowds in parables. This was intentional. This is what he chose to do. And then it confirms this because it says he said nothing to them without a parable. So all they get is parables. That's all they get. And what they're doing is they're revealing the mysteries in a way that some people are understanding it and some people are not. We discovered this in the parable of the soils, how God grants the eyes, the ears to hear and to truly understand what Jesus is saying. And so each time we come to a parable, we have to wonder, do I have ears to hear? So Jesus is telling these parables, but the parables are part of God's plan. Did you know that? That we should have in some way expected parables? Because he says there, oddly enough, this is to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet. And he appeals to Asaph, one of King David's appointed worship leaders, who wrote a psalm. He calls him a prophet, and he appeals to that. He wrote his psalm, Psalm 78, in a way it was like a parable. He even states that up front in Psalm 78. And there he rehearses the history of Israel, things that everybody knew, but he was actually, if you read it, everyone heard what he said, but he was actually giving an embedded message of more than what he was saying. Not everyone understood what he meant. That's how these parables work. And so here Jesus is doing the same thing. Verse 35 quotes Psalm 78. He says, I will open my mouth in parables. But where Asaph in that psalm says, I will utter dark sayings that had been heard before, Matthew says that Jesus is doing this. He is uttering what has been hidden by God since the foundation of the world. So Jesus has taken this parable, the mystery that he is telling us is never been heard before. And it is how the kingdom works. And if we don't understand how the kingdom works, we will be led to think of the kingdom as a disappointment, as not what we expected, and not what God actually wants. So he's asking, he's calling us, he's saying, here's the mystery. This is a parable. And I'm inviting you to believe what I'm actually saying. This is why Matthew goes there. Because we need to understand how the kingdom works. It's not the way we think. It's small. We often don't think that. It's ordinary. It's hidden. It's gradual. But it is certain. And when our eyes begin to tell us it's not as guaranteed as we thought, it's casting doubt on the promises of God, we need to listen. What's going to get us to think it's going to happen? We must listen to the words of our King. These aren't human opinions that he's giving us. They're not just clever illustrations. This is the King himself revealing how the kingdom is going to come into its fulfillment. That means that these parables aren't just things that we admire Jesus for. He told a great story. Oh, that's interesting. He's so wise. He has so much knowledge. He saw things that we never saw before. No, he is calling us to listen to him and to truly hear what our King is saying. The people there couldn't see the tree. The people there couldn't see the branches. The people there couldn't see the birds. They just saw the dough, the flour. That's all they saw. And the only way that they would think this is the kingdom is if they trusted what the King was saying. And this is still the question for us. Will we trust him? We ask questions, the same things. Why is the kingdom so small? Why does it happen? Why is it so hidden? You know, you wonder, you share the gospel, you see it going around the world, and you wonder, is this actually happening? The church seems so weak in this world compared to the kingdoms, which are massive and strong. We think of the kingdom and we think, well, I don't know if it's doing anything. Evil is definitely on the rise. People are not believing. They're leaving the faith. So we wrestle with these same questions. Why is it so small? Why can't it be what God said it was going to be? Why is it working at all? Because it doesn't look like it. And so the parables are meant to answer these questions. They're not new questions. The seed, the kingdom, does really start small. And the leaven just looks like it's there, like nothing is actually happening. But what Jesus is saying, that's not the whole story. Will you trust that I'm working? Will you trust that the kingdom is growing? That though it's small now, it will be the greatest. And though it looks like nothing's happening, it will come to be complete. This is what the parables are calling us to, not just to understand it, but to trust the one who is saying this. And so we need to stop looking at the seed thinking it'll never become what Jesus says. We need to stop looking at the leaven or the flour and think that this leaven could never get through all of that work. We need to stop looking at the construction site and think this will never be built. No, our King knows what he is doing. And our King's word has never failed. And so will you trust him? Do you have ears to hear what he is saying?